In the dying days of World War II, as the Third Reich crumbled under relentless Allied assault, another battle was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. A race not for land or ideology, but for knowledge. In the ruins of Germany's shattered cities, Allied intelligence officers scoured laboratories, bunkers, and research facilities, searching for one thing: scientists. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler were now the most valuable prizes of the post-war world. Their knowledge, born from years of research under the Nazi regime, could change the balance of power in a new kind of conflict that was already beginning: the Cold War. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, a secret program by the United States government to recruit and relocate hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. Some were pioneers in rocketry, chemistry, and medicine. Others had dark pasts, ties to war crimes, concentration camp experiments, and the Nazi Party itself. Yet in the tense atmosphere of 1945, morality was often pushed aside for the sake of strategic advantage. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the Allies found themselves standing amid the technological wreckage of a war that had produced weapons unlike anything seen before. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, early computers, and advanced submarines, all products of German engineering. To many in Washington and London, it was clear that the Third Reich had been decades ahead in certain areas of science. And while the war in Europe had ended, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union was only beginning. Each side knew that whoever captured Germany's brightest minds would gain an enormous edge in the next global contest: the race for atomic power, rockets, and space itself. In the months following the German surrender, small teams of American intelligence officers began scouring the country for scientists to interrogate and recruit. The program was first called Operation Overcast, but soon took on a new, more permanent name: Operation Paperclip, a reference to the paperclips used to attach scientists' personal files to intelligence reports. These were not just low-level engineers. Among them were men who had built Hitler's most ambitious and terrifying projects. Perhaps the most famous was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant but controversial figure. Born in 1912, von Braun had been fascinated by rocketry since childhood. In the 1930s, he joined the German Army's rocket program and later became technical director of the Peenemünde Army Research Center, where the deadly V-2 rocket was developed. The V-2 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile capable of delivering a 1-ton warhead at supersonic speed. Between 1944 and 1945, thousands of these rockets were launched at London, Antwerp, and other cities, killing more than 9,000 civilians. The rockets were assembled at the Mittelwerk facility using forced labor from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, where tens of thousands of prisoners died under horrific conditions. Von Braun and his team knew this. Some claim they had no control over the labor conditions, but the moral stain was undeniable. Yet to American military planners, von Braun's expertise in rocketry was simply too valuable to ignore. When Germany collapsed, von Braun and his team surrendered to the U.S. Army, preferring to fall into American rather than Soviet hands. The Soviets were advancing rapidly from the east, capturing both scientists and technology. Stalin's intelligence agencies had their own parallel effort, Operation Osoaviakum, seizing entire German research centers and transporting scientists to the Soviet Union. The Americans could not afford to be left behind. By late 1945, U.S. officials made a fateful decision. Despite initial hesitation from the State Department, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency authorized the recruitment of hundreds of German specialists. To speed up the process, background checks were often ignored, sanitized, or rewritten. The name Paperclip came from the simple method of marking questionable files. If a scientist's Nazi past was inconvenient, a paperclip was attached to their folder, signifying that their record had been altered to allow entry into the United States. The operation quickly expanded. Scientists from fields as diverse as aerodynamics, chemistry, and medicine were brought to America under secret military orders. They were flown to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where they began testing and developing rockets for the U.S. Army. For the German engineers, life in America was a strange paradox. Just months earlier, they had been working for the Nazi war machine. Now they were honored guests of the U.S. government, helping to build the very weapons that could one day defend or destroy their new homeland. Wernher von Braun became the public face of the program, eventually joining NASA and leading the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, the massive launcher that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the lunar surface, it was von Braun's technology that made it possible. For many Americans, it was a triumph of human ingenuity. But beneath the celebration lay an uncomfortable truth. The foundation of America's space program had been built, in part, on the knowledge of former Nazi scientists. Von Braun was not alone. Operation Paperclip brought over roughly 1,600 German experts, including physicists, chemists, and medical researchers. Some had been deeply involved in the Nazi war effort. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine, had been associated with experiments on prisoners at Dachau. Dr. Kurt Blom, a scientist who had researched biological warfare for the Nazis, was brought to the United States despite his role in human experimentation. Officially, the U.S. sought only those without active Nazi affiliation, but in practice, many records were quietly altered or destroyed. The logic was simple. In a world now divided between East and West, ideology mattered less than expertise. Meanwhile, public awareness of Operation Paperclip remained limited. Most Americans knew nothing of it in the 1940s and 1950s. The Cold War had created a climate of secrecy, and national security justified nearly any action. To reveal that the U.S. was harboring former Nazis would have been politically disastrous. Yet inside government circles, Paperclip was considered a resounding success. German knowledge had accelerated American research in rocketry, aviation, and even pharmaceuticals. The same scientists who once designed weapons for Hitler were now designing the future of space exploration. But not everyone agreed with the moral trade-off. In the early years after the war, a few officials within the U.S. military and State Department voiced concern about bringing Nazi affiliates into the country. The Jewish community, in particular, was outraged when reports began to surface in the late 1940s about the backgrounds of some Paperclip recruits. Journalists and whistleblowers occasionally hinted at the program, but it remained largely hidden until decades later. When documents were declassified in the 1970s, the full scope of Operation Paperclip came to light, revealing how far the U.S. had gone to secure scientific talent. The program's defenders argued that the ends justified the means. Without Paperclip, they claimed, the Soviet Union might have taken the lead in rocketry and space exploration. Indeed, for years after the war, Soviet scientists, many of them also Germans, worked under strict supervision in the USSR, contributing to the development of the R-7 rocket that would later launch Sputnik. The space race, in many ways, was a direct continuation of the competition for German knowledge that began in 1945. Still, the ethical questions remain haunting. Could justice truly be served if war criminals were given sanctuary in exchange for their skills? Did the pursuit of technological dominance excuse the erasure of history's darkest crimes? These questions lingered long after the program ended. Some of the Paperclip scientists lived quiet lives in America, their Nazi pasts largely forgotten. Others, like von Braun, achieved fame and admiration, appearing on television and in magazines as symbols of scientific progress. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1955 and even collaborated with Walt Disney on educational films about space travel. Few Americans watching those programs knew about his role in developing the V-2 rockets that had terrorized London just a decade earlier. By the late 1950s, the world had shifted. The Cold War's front lines were now in the heavens. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, panic spread through Washington. America needed to catch up, and fast. Operation Paperclip's legacy suddenly became invaluable. The expertise of German scientists, once controversial, was now celebrated as essential. Von Braun's team at NASA developed the Redstone and Jupiter rockets, paving the way for Mercury and Apollo missions. The irony was hard to miss. The technology born from a war of destruction had become the engine of humanity's greatest exploration. Yet for the victims of Nazi atrocities, there was no sense of redemption. The laborers who perished building the V-2 rockets were never compensated. The victims of medical experiments conducted by some of the recruited scientists were long forgotten. The moral cost of Operation Paperclip was written in the lives of those who never lived to see the world that these technologies created. In the decades that followed, historians and journalists continued to uncover new details. Declassified documents revealed that U.S. officials had knowingly whitewashed the records of numerous scientists to bypass immigration restrictions. Some had even been members of the SS or had participated in human experimentation. The files showed a deliberate pattern of concealment, an effort to prioritize Cold War advantage over accountability. The revelation sparked outrage, but little official response. By then, many of the scientists were dead or retired, their contributions deeply woven into American scientific history. Operation Paperclip had long since ended, but its influence persisted. The rockets that carried satellites, astronauts, and probes into space were direct descendants of the V-2. The techniques developed for aviation, propulsion, and medicine continued to shape modern technology. Looking back, Operation Paperclip stands as a paradox of history, a triumph of science achieved through moral compromise. It demonstrated how the pursuit of power can blur the lines between right and wrong, between justice and pragmatism. In the shadow of the atomic bomb and the onset of the Cold War, the United States made a calculated decision: better to employ the knowledge of former enemies than let that knowledge fall into rival hands. For the men of Paperclip, the war had simply changed uniforms. They traded the swastika for the stars and stripes, their pasts carefully rewritten by bureaucrats and intelligence officers. For the victims of the regime they once served, there was no such rewriting. Their stories remain buried, overshadowed by the rockets that reached for the sky. When we look at the shining image of a rocket lifting off, a symbol of human progress and exploration, it is easy to forget the darker origins beneath it. Operation Paperclip reminds us that history is rarely simple. Progress often carries a shadow, and the pursuit of knowledge can come at a moral cost. The scientists who helped America win the space race were also the architects of weapons that once devastated Europe. Their brilliance changed the world, but their pasts remind us of the dangers of separating science from conscience. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the legacy of Operation Paperclip remained embedded in both science and memory. The documents are public now, the details known, yet the questions persist. What are we willing to overlook in the name of progress? How much of our modern world rests on foundations built by those once called enemies? The answers are as uncomfortable as they are necessary. Operation Paperclip was not just a secret program. It was a mirror reflecting the moral complexity of the modern age. It showed that even in victory, nations can compromise their values. And it forces us to remember that the pursuit of power, whether in war or in science, always comes with a price.